This global system meant that even countries Britain did not conquer still relied on British trade. At its peak, half of world trade passed through British hands. Think about that. One island nation controlling half of global commerce. This is why the empire became so massive. Not because of population, not because of land power, but because Britain built in almost every region Britain conquered. It used the same formula: find local rivals, support one against the other, gain influence through alliances. Slowly turn allies into subjects. This was not a new idea, but no nation perfected it like the British. In India, they played regional kingdoms against each other. In the Middle East, they redrew borders to keep groups separated. In Southeast Asia, they made treaties that gave them increasing control, and it used its navy to force open new markets. China tried to resist British influence, so Britain used the Opium Wars to open Chinese ports. Africans resisted, so Britain used superior weapons to occupy large parts of Africa. The Industrial Revolution turned Britain into a machine of empire. But Britain did not win through technology alone. It also mastered something far more subtle. At one point, 1 out of every 4 British soldiers was Indian. Now Britain had manpower. Now Britain had wealth. Now Britain had global reach. And it didn't stop there, and took over directly. But the result was the same. India became the backbone of the British Empire. Why? Because India provided taxes, soldiers, raw materials, a massive consumer market and geographic access to Asia and the Middle East at one point. 1 out of every 4 British soldiers was Indian. Now Britain had manpower. Now Britain had wealth. Now Britain had global reach. And it didn't stop there. And once the company gained Bengal's wealth, everything changed. They used Bengal's resources to fund more armies, more wars, and more expansion. By the early 19th century, almost all of India had come under British control, not by the British government, but by a private corporation. Eventually, the British Crown dissolved the company. In the early 17th century, the Mughal Empire ruled India. It was rich, powerful, and advanced. British merchants were allowed to stay only as traders. But slowly, the East India Company turned from merchants into political players. They built forts, created alliances, took sides in local conflicts, gained control over ports, Britain rarely used its own soldiers in huge numbers. Local armies fought local wars, and Britain stepped in only when needed. This strategy allowed Britain to control massive territories with minimal manpower. But the empire was not just about conquest, it was about economics. But here is the twist. English ships were smaller, lighter, and faster. They used different tactics, and a massive storm helped destroy the Spanish fleet. By the 17th century, Britain had the most advanced naval force on Earth. Why was this important? Because whoever controlled the seas controlled the world's trade, and Britain did exactly that. Let's start with the most surprising part. During the Middle Ages, Britain was basically a European nobody. France had more land, Spain had more gold, the Ottomans had more soldiers, China had more technology. Britain, it was poor, agricultural, isolated, and constantly fighting itself. This video answers those questions, but understanding Britain's rise takes more than facts. It requires stepping back into history, into the moments that reshaped the world. Britain. A tiny island in the North Atlantic, cold, rainy, barely any natural resources, and smaller than the state of Michigan. Here is the problem Britain faced. It had ambition, it had ships, but it did not have population. Spain and France had huge armies. The Ottomans had millions of trained soldiers. China had ancient bureaucratic systems and massive manpower. Britain, it had merchants. Spain lost. England survived. And from that moment, one idea spread across England. If Spain can build an empire, why can't we? Moments when a small, irrelevant island transformed into the most powerful empire humanity had ever seen. In this journey, we'll uncover. Yet this small island once controlled 25% of the entire planet. A quarter of Earth's land. Nearly 500 million people. Territories across every ocean, every continent, every climate. So the British government took a unique approach: we can't conquer land ourselves, so let's let companies do it. This solved everything. The companies took the risks. The companies paid for ships, forts, and soldiers. The companies handled diplomacy. And Britain got trade, wealth, taxes, and influence without spending a penny. This model was so successful that it became Britain's blueprint for global expansion. Which brings us to the greatest prize the empire ever obtained. Yes, not kings, not nobles, not generals, but companies, and the most infamous of them all was the British East India Company. This wasn't a normal company. It could sign treaties, collect taxes, maintain an army, start wars, and even conquer entire regions. This is the real beginning of the British Empire. Not soldiers, not colonies, not kings. The Navy. Britain knew it could never compete on land. Its population was too small, so it invested everything into ships. At its peak, the East India Company had a private army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of Britain's real army. And this private company is the reason Britain took control of India. But before we reach that story, we need to understand why Britain used companies to conquer the world. It wasn't until a single event, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, that everything changed. How the British Navy became unstoppable. How trading companies turned into private armies. Why India became the jewel of the empire. How Britain conquered not with population, but with economics and strategy, and finally could any nation ever repeat what Britain did?